My name is Chloe. When his terrified, bloodshot eyes finally snapped up and locked onto mine across the chaotic dining room, I did not cry. Before I tell you how I methodically dismantled my husband's fraudulent charity empire, exposed his violent underworld debts, and sent his entire family to a federal penitentiary, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Growing up, I was constantly taught that family is everything. Julian is 34 years old. I paid the exorbitant mortgage on the massive house we lived in. Valerie is 58 years old. And then there is Jasmine, Julian's 29-year-old sister, and her loud, arrogant husband, Darnell. This particular Sunday evening felt heavy and suffocating. Jasmine and Darnell were currently lounging on my custom Italian leather sofa in the living room, arguing loudly and about the Atlanta Falcons game playing on the massive flat-screen television. As I walked slowly back down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the formal dining room, I stopped dead in my tracks. The main dining room opens up directly to a large, beautiful sunroom lined with massive sliding glass patio doors. He was hovering intently over my specifically designated seat. In his large right hand was a tiny, precisely folded piece of wax paper. My breath caught sharply in my throat, freezing my lungs entirely. I instantly pressed my back flat against the cold hallway wall, ensuring I was out of his line of sight. What was that white powder? I felt a sudden freezing cold sweat break out across the back of my neck and my chest. A weaker, far more emotional woman would have immediately stormed into that dining room. But I am not weak and I am certainly not naive. I took 3 slow, steadying breaths. I walked casually into the dining room. Julian looked up at me as I entered. "Mom just served the gumbo." "Thank you, sweetheart," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady, light, and devoid of any suspicion. I sat down gracefully and stared directly at the dark, rich stew, sitting directly in front of me on the pristine white placemat. From the living room, Darnell suddenly yelled something obnoxious and loud about a horrible pass on the football field. At the absolute head of the long dining table sat Valerie. She had just pulled her heavy chair in and was delicately adjusting her pristine white silk napkin onto her lap. That is when the horrible, devastating truth hit me with the crushing force of a runaway freight train. She knew, but I did not have the luxury of time to properly process the profound emotional devastation or the absolute heartbreak of their joint betrayal. I looked down at my poisoned bowl, then looked directly over at Valerie's untouched bowl, resting at the head of the table. I put on my absolute best innocent deferential voice. "It looks like Julian accidentally gave me the bowl with all the premium, extra-large crab meat." Valerie paused, her eyes narrowed slightly in deep suspicion. "You cooked over a hot stove all day long," I continued smoothly, standing up from my chair. "You deserve the best portion here. Let me trade with you." Before Valerie could even fully register what I was doing, or offer a single syllable of protest, I moved with lightning speed. Valerie frowned deeply, her immense toxic pride actively warring with whatever dark, horrific knowledge she was secretly hiding. "Well, you are right about that, Chloe," Valerie said, a smug, condescending little smirk forming on her face. "It is only fair the respected matriarch of this family gets the finest cuts of meat." She picked up her heavy silver spoon. I sat back down in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. Julian walked back into the dining room, shaking his head at the football score, and muttering angrily under his breath. I picked up my spoon, dipped it into the safe, untainted gumbo I had taken directly from Valerie, and brought it to my lips. "This is delicious, Valerie," I lied smoothly, turning my head to look directly into my husband's eyes. I watched Julian let out a tiny, almost imperceptible sigh of profound relief. Valerie, meanwhile, had already eagerly taken 3 large spoonfuls of the poisoned bowl. I kept eating slowly, my eyes darting subtly between Julian and his arrogant mother. The conversation around the dinner table was mundane and utterly pointless. And then 5 minutes after we sat down, the poison finally took hold. Valerie suddenly stopped chewing. She brought both of her trembling hands up to her throat, her dark eyes widening in sheer absolute panic. "Mom?" Jasmine asked, immediate annoyance lacing her voice because her pointless story had been rudely interrupted. "What is wrong with you?" Valerie could not answer her. The ice water spilled across the table, soaking rapidly into the fabric. "Mom!" Julian yelled, jumping out of his chair so fast it tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. Suddenly, thick, white, bubbly foam began pouring rapidly from the corners of Valerie's mouth. Her fragile body immediately began to convulse violently. Jasmine started screaming at the absolute top of her lungs, a piercing, blood-curdling sound that echoed through the entire house. The entire formal dining room erupted into absolute terrifying chaos. But I did not scream. Julian was on his knees right next to his mother, his large hands hovering uselessly over her convulsing body, paralyzed by sheer fear and profound shock. Slowly, as the horrific, devastating reality of the situation finally crashed down on his brain, his head snapped up. Then his frantic gaze shifted rapidly from my calm face, directly down to the bowl of gumbo I was eating from the bowl with the massive, premium crab legs, the exact bowl he had personally laced with the lethal white powder just moments ago. He knew. In that split second, amidst the hysterical screaming of his sister and the absolute chaos of the dining room, my husband realized he had just poisoned his own mother. And I stared right back at him. The piercing wail of the ambulance sirens tore through the quiet suburban neighborhood, shattering the fake illusion of our perfect Sunday evening. Julian had insisted on riding in the back with her. Jasmine and Darnell were following right behind us in Darnell's leased black BMW, tailgating the ambulance, likely speeding wildly, and running red lights to keep up with the flashing emergency sirens. When we finally arrived at the massive Atlanta Medical Center, the emergency bay doors blew open. Anaphylaxis. They rushed Valerie through the heavy double doors directly into the intensive care unit, leaving us standing helplessly in the stark, bright, fluorescent lighting of the hospital waiting room. Julian collapsed into one of the cheap, stiff vinyl waiting room chairs, burying his face in his large hands. To any casual outside observer, he looked like a devastated son, terrified of losing his beloved, devout mother. I rushed over and knelt gracefully beside his chair, placing a trembling, supportive hand on his knee. "Julian," I sobbed, pitching my voice to sound broken and helpless. "What did the doctors say in the back of the ambulance?" He flinched at my touch, reacting as if I had physically burned him with a hot iron. Before Julian could even attempt to formulate a pathetic answer, the automatic glass doors slid open, and Jasmine stormed into the waiting room, with Darnell trailing closely behind her. She did not even look at her trembling brother. "What did you do to my mother?" Jasmine screamed at the top of her lungs. Her sharp, aggressive voice echoed off the waiting room walls, drawing the immediate, intense attention of every single nurse, security guard, and patient in the entire vicinity. "Jasmine, please," I whispered, stepping back defensively and holding my hands up in a gesture of pure surrender. "She just started choking at the table. Do not play dumb with me, Chloe," Jasmine yelled, taking another aggressive step forward until she was invading my personal space. "You hated that she was the respected matriarch of this family. And you were just some arrogant outsider, trying to blindly buy your way in with your real estate money." Julian stood up abruptly from the vinyl chair. "Jasmine is right," Julian said, his voice loud, booming, and accusatory. "You bought the groceries yesterday, Chloe. Did you leave it sitting out in your hot car while you were doing your little business deals?" I stared at him, letting my mouth fall open in an executed portrait of absolute shock and devastating marital betrayal. "Julian, I bought the seafood at the premium organic market just like I always do," I pleaded, my voice breaking flawlessly. "I followed her recipe perfectly, do not lie to us." Jasmine shrieked, clapping her hands together with every single word to emphasize her fake theatrical outrage. "You have always been a bitter, nasty woman disguised in expensive tailored suits." They were loud-talking me in front of a dozen total strangers, viciously weaponizing the offensive, ingrained stereotype of the angry, jealous black woman to successfully build an instant alibi right there in the hospital waiting room. Darnell stood right behind them, nodding his head in firm, pathetic agreement, adding his own unhelpful comments about how I always thought I was fundamentally better than everyone else just because I owned a successful commercial business. I lowered my head, bringing my trembling hands up to my face to hide my expression as my shoulders heaved with fake, Dramatic sobs, I let them yell. My mind was a cold steel trap, running rapid calculations, intensely analyzing every single micro-expression on Julian's handsome, lying face. He was not just scared that his mother was going to die. Because if Valerie woke up, the federal authorities would immediately ask her what she ate. He was wildly overcompensating, shouting at me about cheap seafood to rapidly establish a plausible excuse for severe food poisoning or an extreme allergic reaction. The dark realization settled deep into my bones like solid, heavy ice. I felt a sudden sharp twist in my lower stomach, a harsh physical reminder of my own vulnerability in this situation. I needed undeniable, concrete proof. "I am so sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking flawlessly on cue. "I would never, ever hurt her." Jasmine scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes dramatically and turning her back on me in pure, unadulterated disgust. Julian stared at me for a long, heavy, utterly terrifying moment. He was intensely searching my face, desperately looking for any in it that I knew what he had done in that dining room. I gave him nothing but a look of complete, shattered devastation. The intense tension in Julian's broad shoulders loosened just a fraction of an inch. He reached out and grabbed my upper arms, his grip bruising and too tight under the false guise of an emotional embrace. "But if the doctors come out here and officially declare this was food poisoning from your cheap ingredients, you and I are going to have a very serious conversation about your unbelievable carelessness regarding my family." I nodded meekly, staring blankly at his expensive silk tie, the exact one I had bought him for his birthday. "Yes, Julian," I replied softly, playing the submissive, obedient role he so desperately wanted in a wife. "I just want her to be okay." Just then, a tall, serious doctor wearing dark blue scrubs emerged from the heavy emergency room doors. "Family of Valerie Davis," he called out softly, holding a silver medical clipboard in his hands. Julian let go of my arms instantly and sprinted toward him. Every single step I took felt like walking through deep, freezing water. I excused myself briefly from the suffocating tension of the waiting room, claiming I desperately needed a strong cup of black coffee to steady my severely frayed nerves. I ignored her completely. My mind was spinning with the terrifying reality of what I had just survived. As I approached the heavy metal door of stairwell B, I heard a sudden, sharp scuffle. I froze instantly. The aggressive, hushed voices leaking through that tiny crack belonged to the two men I had just left in the waiting area. I pressed my back flat against the cold concrete wall right next to the stairwell door. "What the hell did you actually give her?" Darnell hissed violently. "Keep your damn voice down," Julian snapped back, his tone sharp and laced with absolute panic. "Just one single packet." "One packet of what?" Darnell demanded, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "Why is she dying on a ventilator right now?" The words hit me like a massive physical blow directly to the chest. "Miscarriage." My vision actually blurred for a terrifying second. "I do not know what happened," Julian whispered frantically, his voice trembling with a cowardice I had never heard before. "It was not supposed to cause a severe allergic reaction." "You bought black market pills from a street dealer to slip into your wife's food?" Darnell accused, his breathing heavy and erratic. "And if they look into your finances and see that massive hole in your charity account, they are going to lock both of us up in federal prison. I am not going down for attempted murder just because you wanted to play pharmacist to get out of being a father." Darnell added. "Shut up, Darnell," Julian commanded desperately. "Now get back to the waiting room before she notices we are gone." I heard their heavy footsteps moving toward the metal door. I forced my legs to move normally, even though my entire body was numb with horrific shock. Julian was not just trying to poison me, but how did he even know? I walked slowly back to the waiting room, gripping the hot paper cup so tightly my knuckles turned white. As soon as I took my seat, the doctor in the long white coat pushed back through the swinging double doors. "Are you Chloe, the daughter-in-law?" the doctor asked quietly, his clipboard held tightly against his chest. "Yes, that is me," I replied, standing up immediately. Julian rushed over, putting a possessive, heavy arm around my waist to forcefully assert his dominance as the husband. "I am her son," Julian said loudly, making sure the entire waiting room heard him. Tell me what is happening with my mother. The doctor looked at Julian, then looked directly back at me with a very strange, intensely protective expression. Valerie is currently stable, but her condition is extremely critical, the doctor explained carefully. However, I need to speak with Chloe privately for a moment regarding the toxicology report and some standard admission questions. Julian tightened his massive grip on my waist, his thick fingers digging painfully into my side. Anything you need to say to my wife you can say right here in front of me, Julian demanded, his voice carrying a dangerous defensive edge. We do not keep secrets in this family. The doctor did not flinch. Please follow me. Chloe, I gently but firmly peeled Julian's bruising fingers off my waist. I will be right back, sweetheart, I said softly, giving him a reassuring look that masked the burning, volcanic hatred screaming through my veins. I followed the doctor into the small consultation room. Chloe, I am going to be direct with you, the doctor began, his tone dropping to a serious, confidential whisper. Because Valerie has a pre-existing heart condition, the massive dose of unrefined chemicals sent her body into immediate anaphylactic shock. But that is not the only reason I pulled you in here, Chloe, he continued. They noted that they tried to call your home phone several times to deliver the critical news, but your husband kept intercepting the calls. Chloe, your blood work indicates that you are 8 weeks pregnant. Julian knew. The sterile walls of the consultation room seemed to close in on me entirely. I walked out of that small consultation room a different woman than the naive one who had walked in just minutes prior. Every single step I took down the stark, bright white hospital hallway was a masterclass in severe emotional suppression. Julian wanted me to bleed out on his mother's expensive hardwood floor. As the waiting room came fully into view, I saw Julian pacing near a row of vending machines. I forced my facial muscles to soften completely. Julian turned his head and saw me walking slowly toward him. Every single protective instinct in my body screamed at me to claw his eyes out. I love you so much, I whispered softly into his chest, my voice shaking with a manufactured terror that he bought without question. She is strong. I felt his entire body go rigid against mine. It was just a microsecond of stiffness, a tiny involuntary muscular reaction. But my trained, heightened senses caught it immediately. Thank God, Julian replied, his voice thick with a fake theatrical emotion that made my stomach churn. I do not know what I would ever do without my family. I pulled back from the hug, wiping my eyes delicately with the back of my hand. I need to go to the restroom and splash some cold water on my face, I told him, keeping my head bowed in a show of pure, overwhelming exhaustion. I will be right back, sweetheart. He nodded quickly, already turning his nervous attention back to his anxious brother-in-law. I dropped the grieving, terrified wife act the exact second the metal latch clicked into place. I leaned over the porcelain toilet, my stomach rejecting the black coffee I had forced down in the cafeteria earlier. I bypassed my normal contacts list and manually dialed a secure unlisted phone number I had memorized several years ago. Desmond, I said, my voice dropping to a sharp, authoritative whisper. Desmond was a former Atlanta police precinct captain, who now ran an exclusive, exceptionally high-end private security and investigation firm. Chloe, Desmond replied instantly, immediately recognizing the serious, dangerous edge in my tone. What is the emergency tonight? I need a complete digital and financial dissection on 2 absolute targets immediately. I instructed coldly, staring fiercely at the metal door of the bathroom stall. My husband Julian and his brother-in-law Darnell. I want every single text message, every single deleted email, and every hidden encrypted messaging application actively running on their cell phones. Find out where Darnell has been throwing his money in the cryptocurrency market. And Desmond, I continued, my voice devoid of mercy. Money is no object for this job. Consider it done, Desmond said without a single moment of hesitation or unnecessary questioning. Do I need to actively send a security team to your location? Not anymore, I replied quietly, stepping out of the stall and staring at my cold, dead reflection in the large mirror above the stainless steel sinks. But they are. I will personally text you their full legal names and social security numbers directly from my secure encrypted server right now. Send all the preliminary investigative files directly to the ghost email account we successfully set up for the downtown commercial project last year. I ended the call immediately. I walked over to the sinks, turned the faucet on high, and splashed freezing cold water directly onto my face. I was no longer a naive victim waiting to be silently slaughtered in my own dining room. I dried my face carefully, reapplied a small amount of lip gloss to maintain appearances, and stepped confidently back out into the bright, chaotic waiting room. Just as I took my seat next to Julian, the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit swung open once again. "Family of Valerie Davis," he called out, his voice steady and professional, cutting through the background noise of the hospital. Julian and Jasmine practically sprinted to the center of the room to intensely meet him. "Your mother has officially stabilized," the doctor announced calmly to the entire group. "She is going to survive this ordeal, but it will be a very long, difficult road to full recovery." Jasmine immediately burst into loud, theatrical tears, throwing her arms up in the air and loudly praising God at the absolute top of her lungs. Julian let out a long, heavy breath, rubbing his large hand forcefully over his sweating face. Within an hour of the doctor's official announcement, the news of Valerie's sudden horrific hospitalization had spread rapidly through our tight-knit, African-American church community. They clustered tightly around Julian, offering him fervent prayers and words of deep spiritual comfort. This was Julian's absolute element. The devil truly tried to attack this righteous family tonight. Julian preached to the small, devoted crowd. "We serve a God of absolute healing and divine protection." The older church members nodded enthusiastically, murmuring their loud agreements and offering quiet, continuous praises. "Family is all we truly have in this dark, unforgiving world," Julian continued passionately, wiping a single-time tear directly from his cheek. "When you actively face the ultimate terrifying trials of life, when the violent storms fiercely try to drown you in despair, you quickly realize that your blood, your family, your devoted wife, and your unshakable faith are the only things that truly matter in the end. I am so unbelievably blessed to have my beautiful, strong wife, Chloe, standing right by my absolute side through this horrific, traumatizing ordeal." He reached out his hand lovingly toward me. "She has been my absolute rock tonight." Julian lied effortlessly to the gathered congregation. "She is the strongest, most supportive woman I have ever known." The older women in the room smiled warmly at me, and utterly unaware that they were looking at an arrogant man who had just actively tried to murder his own unborn child for a massive financial payout. He was deliberately using his own mother's near-death experience to bolster his own righteous, flawless image in the community. I leaned my head gently against his broad shoulder, letting the congregation eagerly see the picture-perfect, loving couple they so desperately wanted to believe in. But in my calculated mind, I was already ruthlessly counting down the absolute hours until Desmond delivered the financial files. I turned my back on his sickening, hypocritical performance, keeping my posture straight as I confidently walked out of the intensive care unit. The exact moment the automatic sliding doors of the hospital lobby closed securely behind me, the warm, humid Atlanta night air hit my face. My pristine black Mercedes-Benz S-Class was parked on the secluded third level, sitting where I had abandoned it hours ago when we blindly followed the ambulance. I did not turn the powerful engine on. 12 minutes later, the passenger side door opened smoothly. Desmond slid effortlessly into the seat right next to me, instantly bringing with him the faint, distinct smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap diner coffee. He did not offer a single meaningless pleasantry. "You were right to call me, Chloe," Desmond said, his gravelly voice devoid of any human emotion. "He is a desperate, extremely dangerous man backed into an impossible corner." I stared intensely at the glowing screen of the tablet. Desmond tapped the digital screen, instantly pulling up a complex web of bank statements, frantic wire transfers, and encrypted offshore routing numbers. "Let us start with the pristine reputation of his precious nonprofit organization," Desmond began, pointing a thick, calloused finger directly at a highlighted column of rapidly declining numbers. "Over the absolute last 8 months, Julian has systematically embezzled $5 million from the charity's main operating account. He used a complex series of untraceable phantom vendors and falsified invoice records to constantly drain the funds. He genuinely thought he was being clever, but he carelessly left a digital trail a complete mile wide. I felt a freezing cold wave of absolute disbelief wash over me. 1. $5 million, I repeated, the sheer magnitude of the staggering number tasting like burnt ash in my mouth. We do not live an extravagant lifestyle beyond what my own commercial real estate income easily supports. He deliberately gave it to Darnell, Desmond stated bluntly, actively pulling up a new document on the glowing tablet. It was a massive, detailed spreadsheet meticulously outlining hundreds of high-volume, reckless cryptocurrency trades. Darnell actively convinced your arrogant husband that he had brilliantly cracked the complex algorithm of a new, volatile offshore crypto market. Instead, Darnell lost every single penny in a catastrophic market crash 4 months ago. The money is gone, Chloe, evaporated into digital thin air. I closed my eyes tightly, pressing my fingers hard against my pounding temples. But that did not explain the poison. It gets much worse, Desmond continued smoothly, his gravelly voice dropping a full octave as he swiped to the very next page of the detailed report. In a frantic, idiotic attempt to rapidly win it all back and cover his illegal tracks, Darnell foolishly borrowed from a violent, unforgiving underground organized crime syndicate directly based out of Chicago. He massively leveraged his own life, and by extension Julian's life, on a guaranteed return that never materialized. And they made it abundantly clear that Julian is actively next on their violent list because he originally funded the entire operation. My heart slammed against my ribs. So Julian is broke, and the organized mob is actively hunting his family, I said slowly, piecing the horrific, terrifying puzzle together. He definitely knows that. Desmond looked directly at me with an expression of deep, profound pity. He reached into the thick manila folder and slowly pulled out a single redacted legal document. He cannot rapidly liquidate your commercial properties, Desmond agreed quietly. But he can cash out this. I looked down at the heavy document. My specific name was clearly listed as the primary insured. $5 million. The charity's respected board of directors is officially scheduled to conduct a independent financial audit on the 1st of next month, Desmond explained clearly, tapping the paper. He desperately needed a untraceable influx of clean cash, and he needed it before the audit. I felt the warm blood drain from my face. He deliberately took out a $5 million policy on my life. I whispered, the horrific, terrifying reality of the massive situation finally shattering my absolute last shred of denial. Yes, Desmond said softly. Julian bought it anyway. My breath caught in my throat. I looked out the dark, tinted window of the Mercedes, my sharp mind actively flashing back to the dining room. He knew about the baby, I said heavily, my voice sounding hollow and dead. He actively knew I was pregnant, Desmond nodded slowly. If you had actually eaten that gumbo, you would have actively started bleeding out within hours. You would have bled to death in your own bed. I dropped the heavy insurance document onto the center console as if it had physically burned my actual skin. The pure, unadulterated evil of his massive, calculated plan was staggering. He was going to stand at my public funeral wearing a sharp black suit, crying his fake, pathetic tears while the entire church congregation told him how strong he was. He almost got away with it, I whispered fiercely to the empty car. My baby would be dead. Desmond leaned forward, his massive, capable hands resting on his knees. Chloe, I have a fully armed, trained security team, sitting directly in 2 unmarked vehicles at the tight perimeter of this hospital right now. You do not ever have to look at him ever again. I sat still in the heavy silence, staring directly at the intensely illuminated dashboard of my expensive car. I thought about the sheer absolute terror I fiercely felt when the doctor firmly told me I was pregnant. And I thought about Julian, the handsome man who smoothly kissed my exact forehead every single morning while and actively planning my violent, bloody execution. Going directly to the police right now was the safe, logical choice. But I was not a normal woman. If I actively handed this over to the authorities now, Julian would simply deliberately hire an expensive, aggressive defense attorney. I did not just want him actively locked in a cold concrete cell. I wanted to actively strip away his stolen money, his pristine reputation, his absolute freedom, and his pathetic, arrogant pride piece by piece. In front of everyone he desperately wanted to actively impress. No, I said firmly, turning my exact head to actively look Desmond directly in the exact eyes. He is backed into a corner. He genuinely thinks the poison failed because his mother accidentally ate the wrong bowl. I corrected him coldly. I am going to let him keep believing that until the absolute moment I publicly execute his entire existence. I picked up the thick manila folder and shoved it deep into my designer leather tote bag. I need you to actively do as I ask, Desmond. I want you to draft the anonymous tips directly to the IRS and the FBI White-Collar Crime Division. But do not hit send until I give you the absolute signal. Desmond studied my face for a long, silent moment. You are the boss, Chloe. I will have men through the front door in 90 seconds. I appreciate that, Desmond, I replied, my voice devoid of any fear. I promise you, by the time I am finished with him, he is going to desperately wish he had eaten that poison himself. Desmond slipped smoothly out of the Mercedes, melting instantly back into the dark shadows of the concrete parking garage. I sat alone for another full 5 minutes, actively taking slow, methodical breaths to lower my intensely elevated heart rate. Nobody was going to hurt us. I confidently grabbed my phone charger, stepped directly out of the vehicle, and securely locked the doors. It was time to go back upstairs and comfort my grieving, actively murderous husband. Every single step I took toward the busy elevator bank required a massive, monumental effort of sheer will. The room was dimly lit by a series of small artificial candles glowing softly against the dark oak-paneled walls. Desmond had sent one final, encrypted file. Mom, I am out of options. Julian's voice echoed loudly over the sound of the car engine. Darnell lost every single dime. I told you never to trust that idiot Darnell with real money. Valerie snapped coldly on the recording. What did this street contact actively say about the pills? He gave me the maximum dosage, Julian sighed heavily. It is guaranteed to terminate the pregnancy, but he warned me it could easily cause a massive fatal hemorrhage. I closed my eyes tightly, feeling a fresh wave of blinding, absolute rage wash over me. Good. Valerie's voice dripped with absolute venom and malice. She is arrogant, loud, and she lacks the proper grace required to actively stand beside a respected man of your high stature. Mom, if this goes wrong, I lose everything, Julian echoed nervously. Listen to me very carefully, Julian, Valerie commanded. Serena comes from real established generational wealth. You really think this will work? Julian finally asked. Of course it will work, Valerie replied confidently. I will plate the food myself in the kitchen, and make sure her specific bowl gets the extra seasoning. I pulled the wireless earbuds out of my ears. I stood up, actively leaving the quiet chapel behind. When I pushed through the heavy waiting room doors, the atmosphere had drastically shifted. The doctor actively walked out. She is conscious. Julian slumped. I rushed directly over to him, immediately wrapping my arms around his waist. Oh, Julian, our prayers were answered, I cried out. When we entered the small room, Valerie looked terrible. We are all here, Mom, Julian whispered intensely, staring directly into her explicit eyes with a hidden warning. Valerie blinked slowly. She knew. I am glad you pulled through, Valerie, I said softly. Sunday dinner just would not be the same without you. Her heart monitor spiked into a frantic rhythm. Back out in the hallway, Julian pulled us actively towards the elevator. We need to talk, Julian said tidy. Let us go down to the cafeteria, in the empty cafeteria. Julian folded his hands. Chloe, the doctor pulled me aside. Julian lied. They are demanding $400. Zuzo by tomorrow. I stared at him. I cannot wire that much. I lied entirely. Jasmine slammed her hands on the table. You owe us. I let my shoulders slump, but my lawyer requires the official hospital documents. Julian glared. I will get them. Julian spat. Perfect. I smiled. The drive back to our sprawling suburban home was a complete blur of neon streetlights and cold calculation. When I finally pulled my Mercedes into the pristine driveway, the massive house looked the same as it had on Sunday evening. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door, bypassed the kitchen where Valerie had prepared her toxic gumbo, and walked straight up the winding stairs to my private home office. I locked the solid oak door securely behind me, booted up my secure desktop computer, and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water. The time for playing the weeping, compliant wife was officially over. I had 48 hours before Julian expected me to hand over $400,000. My very first target was our personal finances. Julian and I maintained a large joint checking and savings account at a premium national bank. It was supposed to be our emergency fund and household operating account. I logged into the banking portal, my fingers flying rapidly across the mechanical keyboard. With a few quick clicks, I initiated a massive wire transfer. I left $1.50 in the joint checking account. It was just enough to keep the account technically active, so Julian would not receive an automatic closure notification, but useless to a desperate man looking to actively pay off the Chicago mob. Next, I systematically removed myself as an authorized user from all of his personal credit cards. I permanently canceled the premium black card he proudly flashed at expensive steakhouses, reporting it lost and locking the credit line. By the time the digital clock on my desk flashed 3 in the morning, Julian's financial safety net was and utterly obliterated. He just did not know it yet. At 7 the next morning, I was already sitting in the sleek, glass-walled downtown office of my lead corporate attorney, Marcus. Marcus was a brilliant, ruthless lawyer who had expertly guided me through my absolute toughest commercial acquisitions. When I walked in, he immediately noticed the dark circles under my eyes and the icy, unyielding set of my jaw. Marcus plugged it directly into his secure terminal. As his eyes scanned the staggering evidence of Julian's massive embezzlement and Darnell's catastrophic cryptocurrency failures, his professional demeanor shifted into pure aggressive combat mode. I told him what Valerie and Julian had attempted to do at Sunday dinner. Marcus did not offer any empty sympathy. We spent the next 9 hours executing a flawlessly coordinated legal maneuver. I legally transferred the complete ownership of my commercial real estate brokerage, all 6 of my lucrative downtown office buildings, and the actual deed to the massive suburban house Julian and I currently lived in directly into an impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust. I named myself as the sole beneficiary, but legally stripped away my own direct, immediate control of the assets on paper. It was an absolute ironclad financial fortress. When I finally signed the notarized document, a massive weight lifted off my chest. My empire was safe. I left Marcus's office late Tuesday afternoon and drove directly to a small, anonymous internet cafe located on the absolute outskirts of the city. I paid in cash, sat at a corner terminal, and logged directly into the ghost email account I shared with Desmond. He had delivered as promised. The inbox was loaded with massive, meticulously organized digital dossiers. I spent the next 4 hours downloading, printing, and categorizing the absolute worst mistakes my husband and his brother-in-law had ever made in their entire pathetic lives. The first stack of papers was a masterpiece of federal tax fraud. It was a perfect, undeniably clear paper trail that categorically proved Julian had willfully and maliciously defrauded a registered nonprofit organization. It was enough evidence to secure a guaranteed federal indictment. The second thick stack of papers belonged to Darnell. It detailed his pathetic, frantic cryptocurrency trading logs. But the crown jewel of the evidence was the transcribed text messages between Darnell and the Chicago syndicate. The messages outlined the debt, the threats against Jasmine, and the timeline for repayment. I organized the heavy documents into 2 thick, damning folders. I did not include any personal notes. The heavy evidence was so complete, so packaged that any junior federal agent could pick it up and successfully secure a massive arrest warrant within hours. I placed the heavy folders into 2 large, heavy-duty cardboard shipping envelopes. I carefully printed the shipping labels using a prepaid, untraceable digital debit card. The first package was addressed directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service, located in Washington. The IRS does not play games with nonprofit tax fraud, and I knew they would immediately freeze the charity's massive accounts the absolute second they reviewed the fake invoices. The second, much thicker package was addressed directly to the Regional Field Office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically marked directly for the white-collar crime and organized crime task force. As the sun began to slowly set on Tuesday evening, casting long, dark shadows across the busy Atlanta streets, I walked confidently into a crowded automated shipping center. I did not wear a disguise, but I wore a large pair of expensive designer sunglasses and deliberately kept my head down to avoid any casual conversation. I slipped both heavy packages securely into the overnight drop box. The heavy metal door clanged shut, echoing loudly in the quiet storefront. My phone vibrated sharply in my purse. It was a text message directly from Julian. He was anxiously asking if Marcus had successfully cleared the $400. Zero's a wire transfer yet. I stared at the glowing screen, a cold, ruthless smile spreading across my face. I typed a quick, reassuring response. I told him Marcus had filed all the necessary paperwork, but the bank required a mandatory 24-hour security hold on a transfer of that massive size. He replied instantly with a series of praying hands and red heart emojis. He genuinely believed he had successfully won. He thought he had successfully manipulated his wealthy, foolish wife into happily paying off his violent debts. He had no idea that, while he was holding court in the hospital waiting room, preaching loudly to the church elders about the sacred bonds of family, I was quietly pulling the entire financial floorboards out from underneath his feet. I walked back to my car, the humid air finally feeling intensely refreshing against my skin. The trap was set, all that was left to do was smile entirely, serve an elegant dinner, and watch the entire family burn to the absolute ground. Wednesday morning arrived with a suffocating humidity that mirrored the dark, intense tension settling over my life. I dressed carefully in a tailored navy blue pantsuit, applying my impressive makeup with the surgical precision of a hardened soldier preparing for brutal warfare. I drove my sleek Mercedes back to the Atlanta Medical Center, securely carrying a leather folder filled with blank documents to easily satisfy Julian's desperate illusion. When I confidently walked into the premium cardiac recovery unit, the atmosphere was sickeningly cheerful. Valerie had been moved directly into a private, spacious recovery suite. When Julian saw me enter, his dark eyes instantly dropped directly to the expensive leather portfolio securely held in my hand. He offered me a brilliant, fake smile, genuinely believing his total financial salvation had finally arrived. I kissed his cheek, playing the obedient wife, and softly whispered that Marcus had successfully processed the entire wire transfer. I told him the hospital billing department would officially see the massive funds clear by 4 o'clock this exact afternoon. The immense, unadulterated relief that washed over Julian's handsome face was almost comical. He squeezed my waist tightly, blind to the massive federal net closing tightly around his throat. Just as Julian finally loudly praised God for the financial miracle, a very polite knock echoed from the heavy wooden door. The heavy door swung open and directly in walked Serena Miller. Serena was the 26-year-old submissive daughter of our head pastor. She was the exact, specific woman Valerie had excitedly mentioned directly on the hidden dashcam recording. She stepped confidently into the private hospital room, carrying a massive, expensive arrangement of stunning white lilies and soft pink roses. She wore a modest but fitted designer sundress, her dark hair styled in flawless soft curls. The exact moment she gracefully crossed the absolute threshold, the entire dynamic directly in the room shifted. Valerie, who had been glaring at me with silent, purely venomous hatred just moments before, suddenly lit up with a warm, welcoming smile. Julian immediately stood up, his posture straightening as he rushed over to eagerly greet her. He gently took the heavy crystal vase from her hands, his thick fingers lingering on hers for a fraction of a second too long. Serena beamed at him, her bright eyes shining with an inappropriate, overly familiar intense adoration that made my stomach and utterly turn. She walked right past me. She then went straight directly to Valerie's monitored bedside. "Oh, Miss Valerie, we have been praying so fiercely for your swift, beautiful recovery." Serena cooed softly, gently placing her manicured hand over Valerie's pale arm. "My father had the entire congregation on their knees last night. The church just is not the same without our beautiful matriarch confidently leading the women's ministry. Valerie patted Serena's soft hand affectionately, her eyes glowing with intense maternal approval. Thank you, my sweet girl. Valerie rasped, her voice still hoarse from the heavy breathing tube. Your beautiful presence here brings me such immense joy today. Serena turned around, slowly and finally directly acknowledged my existence, standing near the very foot of the hospital bed. She looked me up and directly down with a condescending, pitying smile actively playing on her glossy lips. Chloe, you poor exhausted thing, Serena said, confidently stepping closer to me, and gently placing a soft hand lightly on my shoulder. You must be exhausted. Julian told me how stressed you have been lately, with your little real estate business. It was an absolute masterclass in backhanded Southern insults. She was loudly calling me masculine, emotionally closed off, and unsuited for the traditional nurturing role of an explicit wife. Julian shifted very uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the sharp tension, but he did not utter a single word to defend his wife. I did not flinch, I smiled, a cold, predatory smile that did not reach my eyes. Thank you for your profound concern, Serena, I replied smoothly. Actually, I need to go down to the cafeteria to grab a fresh coffee. I would love to hear more about how the church congregation is doing. Serena hesitated, looking at Julian for permission. Julian eagerly nodded. We walked to the elevator in silence. Serena kept her head high, radiating a smug sense of victory. I stepped into her personal space, forcing her to rapidly back up until her shoulder blades hit the cold metal wall. The arrogant smile instantly vanished from her face. You listened to me very carefully, Serena, I whispered coldly. I know who you are, and I know what Valerie promised you once I was removed from the picture. Serena's mouth opened and closed silently. Chloe, I do not know what you are talking about, she stammered weakly. Stop lying, I commanded coldly. You can have him. He maliciously embezzled the money from his own nonprofit charity. Serena let out a sharp involuntary gasp. The IRS and the FBI are currently reviewing his falsified financial documents. I continued mercilessly. But the federal agents are not the worst part. Those dangerous men are actively threatening to physically dismember family members if they do not get their money by Friday. The elevator car chimed loudly, revealing the bright hospital entrance. He is all yours, I said calmly. Have a blessed day. Serena abandoned her pristine composure and sprinted toward the glass exit doors, running as fast as her legs could carry her. One massive piece of Julian's pathetic backup plan was destroyed forever. By Friday morning, the local hospital officially discharged Valerie. He genuinely believed my lawyer had successfully processed his phantom wire transfer. He thought the violent loan sharks were paid off, and his charity accounts were officially reloaded before the massive board audit. He insisted we host a massive Thanksgiving and healing dinner at our house on Saturday evening. He framed it as a gathering to loudly praise God for saving his mother. I did not argue, I simply smiled, confidently handed him my premium corporate credit card for the expensive catering, and told him to invite anyone he wanted. Saturday evening arrived, with a suffocating southern heat. My sprawling suburban home, the massive house I had purchased with my own blood, sweat, and tears, was transformed into a lively banquet hall. By 7 in the evening, nearly 40 people had arrived. The elite guest list included the most prominent members of our congregation, several extremely wealthy charity board members, and of course his toxic extended family. Jasmine strutted through my front door, wearing a tight cocktail dress, acting as if she owned the expensive floorboards directly beneath her feet. Darnell followed closely behind, but his usual loud swagger was gone. The Chicago syndicate had given him until Friday to pay. It was now Saturday night. Pastor Miller arrived shortly after, looking tense and confused. His beautiful daughter, Serena, was noticeably absent. He had no explicit idea she was actively running far away from his rapidly impending federal indictment. Then Valerie made her anticipated grand entrance. Julian practically carried her gently through the heavy front door. Valerie soaked up the adoration like a parched sponge. She cast a brief, venomous glare in my direction when nobody was looking, but quickly shifted her face back into a benevolent, submissive smile for her religious audience. I smiled directly back at her, a cold, predatory smile that promised complete ruin. The catered dinner was a chaotic symphony of clinking silver forks, loud laughter, and aggressive bragging. The catering staff moved silently around the tables, pouring expensive imported wine into crystal glasses, and serving generous portions of roasted lamb and seasoned vegetables. Julian sat at the absolute head of the main table, positioning himself as the undisputed patriarch of the entire gathering. He loudly regaled the wealthy charity board members with fabricated stories of his daily hospital vigils. As the main course was finally cleared away, the atmosphere in the room grew heavy with anticipation. Julian stood up abruptly, tapping his heavy silver spoon against his crystal water glass. "Friends, family, and esteemed elders," Julian began, his voice booming with the practiced resonance of a Sunday morning sermon. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate a literal miracle. But through the incredible power of your dedicated prayers, my beautiful mother is sitting right here with us tonight." Loud murmurs of agreement and sudden applause rippled through the dining room. Julian raised his hand, signaling for the room to quiet down once again. "This terrifying ordeal has reminded me of what truly matters in this life," Julian continued, his tone shifting into something intensely manipulative and dark. "It reminded me that we must be willing to sacrifice our own material wealth to ensure the less fortunate are adequately cared for." He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick cream-colored legal folder. "My beautiful wife Chloe has been my absolute anchor," Julian announced loudly, ensuring every single person in the room could hear him clearly. "And because her heart is so full of gratitude for my mother's miraculous recovery, Chloe has decided to make an unprecedented, truly massive sacrifice to honor God tonight." A sudden, uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Jasmine leaned forward in her chair, a malicious knowing smirk spreading across her face. Julian began walking slowly down the length of the dining table. He stopped right behind my chair. "Chloe has generously agreed to legally transfer the complete ownership of two of her most lucrative downtown commercial properties directly into my nonprofit charity organization," Julian declared to the shocked crowd. "These massive assets will provide millions of dollars in sustained funding. It is a monumental gift of faith." The room erupted, the charity board members gasped audibly, stunned by the sheer magnitude of the supposed donation. Julian leaned down, pressing his chest against my back. He unclipped the black ink pen and placed it deliberately into my right hand. "Go ahead, my love," Julian whispered directly into my ear. His voice was devoid of any real affection. "Show everyone here how much you truly love this family." The rhythmic clapping of 40 eager guests echoed loudly off the formal dining room walls. I looked down at the shiny black pen resting in my palm. The papers were flawless, drafted by an expensive attorney, designed to immediately transfer the irrevocable deeds of my properties directly into his fraudulent charity account. I raised my head slowly, bypassing my husband entirely, and locked my eyes directly onto Valerie's smug, arrogant face at the far end of the table. I held her gaze firmly as I slowly moved my right hand off the edge of the dining table. I deliberately opened my fingers completely. The heavy black ink pen slipped instantly from my grasp. It fell rapidly through the empty air and hit the solid hardwood floor with a sharp, loud clatter that pierced the sudden, heavy silence of the room. I sat back straight in my chair, adjusting my posture to radiate absolute unyielding authority. "No," I said loudly. My voice was a clear ringing command that carried effortlessly across the entire dining room. "And I will certainly not do it to honor a woman who actively plotted my violent murder." The immediate reaction was absolute terrifying pandemonium. Jasmine sprang up from her chair. "You selfish, lying, disgusting witch!" Jasmine screamed at the absolute top of her lungs. "How dare you publicly humiliate my generous brother?" Darnell jumped up right next to her, but he was not yelling. He was backing away from the dining table, his face draining of all natural color, his eyes wide with absolute horror. The flawless, charming mask Julian had worn for our entire marriage shattered into a million jagged pieces. The handsome, devoted Christian husband vanished entirely, instantly replaced by a desperate, violent and dangerous cornered animal. His face turned a deep, terrifying crimson. He grabbed my upper arm with both of his massive hands, yanking me upward. "You are going to pick up that pen right now," Julian growled directly into my face, out of his mind with pure, uncontrollable, desperate rage. I stared directly into his wild, bloodshot eyes, refusing to flinch. "You cannot force me to do anything, Julian," I replied coldly. "You are a pathetic, desperate, lying thief, and your entire pathetic empire of lies is actively burning to the absolute ground right this very second." He raised his massive right hand high into the humid air, his thick fingers curling tightly into a heavy, devastating fist. He was preparing to strike me directly in the face. Instead of cowering, I grabbed his thick wrist with a sudden vicious strength. I twisted his arm sharply downward, using his own aggressive forward momentum against him, and forcefully ripped my bruised shoulder out of his violent grip. I reached into the deep pocket of my tailored dress and quickly pulled out my cell phone. My fingers moved rapidly across the glowing screen, instantly opening the smart home application. I cranked the digital volume slider all the way up to its absolute maximum limit. Then I selected the master audio track and pressed play. The massive definition speakers hidden in the ceiling instantly roared to life. "What the hell did you actually give her?" Darnell's panicked voice shook the crystal glasses on the banquet table. "Keep your damn voice down," Julian's recorded voice snapped back. "I gave her what we discussed, just one single packet. You told me that stuff was just supposed to induce a natural miscarriage. Why the hell is your mother in anaphylactic shock?" The word miscarriage hung in the dining room air like a detonated explosive. Jasmine let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream, dropping her wineglass. "Shut up, Darnell," Julian's recorded voice commanded desperately through the speakers. "Chloe ate the safe bowl, we just have to stick to the story." The entire dining room erupted into absolute deafening gasps of pure horror. Pastor Miller physically stumbled backward, utterly repulsed by the demonic confession echoing from the ceiling. The audio transitioned smoothly to the dashcam recording. "I told you never to trust that idiot Darnell with real money," Valerie's recorded voice snapped coldly through the speakers. "What did the street contact actively say about the pills?" "He gave me the maximum dosage," Julian answered on the recording. "He said it is unrefined, extremely potent. It is guaranteed to terminate the pregnancy. But he warned me it could easily cause a massive fatal hemorrhage." "Good," Valerie's recorded voice replied, her tone dripping with absolute venom. "Do not let that ghetto girl actively tie you down forever with a child. And then, you can marry Pastor Miller's beautiful daughter." When Pastor Miller heard his own daughter's name tied to this horrific, bloody murder plot, he let out a loud, agonized groan of pure devastation. He fell into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Jasmine lost her mind. She lunged at Darnell, striking his chest with her fists. "You are an absolute monster," Valerie suddenly gasped loudly. She threw her right hand dramatically over her chest, clutching the fabric of her silk gown. But nobody moved. The men and women who had praised her just moments ago simply stared down at her trembling body with absolute unadulterated disgust. I walked slowly around the chaotic dining table and stood directly over Valerie. She opened one eye, realizing her theatrical performance was failing miserably. "You should have checked the recipe, Valerie," I whispered coldly. Before Valerie could respond, the heavy atmosphere in the dining room was shattered by a piercing mechanical wail. Brilliant, blinding flashes of red and blue emergency lights suddenly tore through the sheer fabric of my expensive custom window treatments. The heavy reinforced oak front doors were kicked off their solid brass hinges by a massive steel battering ram. Over a dozen armed federal agents and local Atlanta police officers swarmed into the grand foyer. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." A towering lead agent roared at the top of his lungs. Two massive tactical officers immediately charged directly at Julian. They tackled my arrogant husband to the floor, driving his chest forcefully into the spilled wine and broken glass. "You are under federal arrest for attempted murder, criminal conspiracy, and severe federal financial fraud." the lead agent recited loudly, snapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Across the room, 3 other officers dragged a sobbing, hysterical Darnell out from against the wall. Julian twisted his neck painfully against the wet floorboards, looking up at me with tears streaming rapidly down his bruised face. "Chloe, please," he begged pitifully. "You have to help me. I am your husband." I did not even blink. I simply stepped over his trembling legs, walking slowly toward Valerie, who was still laying still on the floor. "I know you can hear me, Valerie," I said, my voice devoid of any human mercy. "I legally transferred the ownership of this property into an irrevocable blind trust 3 days ago. You are currently trespassing on private corporate property." I dropped the formal, legally binding 24-hour eviction notice directly onto her trembling chest. "You and your horrible daughter have until tomorrow night to pack your cheap bags and get out of my home. If I find either of you still standing on my lawn by sunset, I will have you dragged out by the local sheriff for criminal trespassing." I stood up, smoothing the expensive fabric of my tailored dress, and turned my back on the pathetic wreckage of the Davis family. I walked calmly past the armed federal agents, past the stunned silent church elders, and stepped gracefully out through the shattered front doors. The humid, warm Atlanta night air immediately wrapped around me, feeling fresh and liberating. I walked out onto the expansive front porch, gently placing my hand directly over my lower stomach, feeling a deep, profound surge of fierce, protective, motherly love wash over my soul. Ladies, never let a toxic family use loyalty to dig your grave. Loyalty is not a blind submission to pure abuse. Tell me in the comments how you cut off toxic relatives and hit subscribe for more.